The absolute mad lad himself, the Dizzle, David Wood, has defended Muhammad. We knew he was a psychopath, but this just proves that. So recently, David Wood debated Robert Spencer on whether or not Muhammad was actually real. Of course, David Wood, being the psychopath that he is, he decided to defend Muhammad as a real person. Of course, Robert Spencer has historically taken the position that Muhammad is a fabrication by later writers. But let's look at the debate. Okay, obviously this is modern day debate, and the link to the full debate will be in the show notes. But I want to look at the closing statements and give my 2 cents. So here we go.
I'm going to jump into the 5-minute closings, and then we'll have Q&A from the audience. So, David, thanks very much. The floor is all yours.
Well, thanks again, James and Robert. I did want to point out here in my conclusion that Robert and I we agree on a lot. We agree there are all kinds of problems with the Muslim sources. We agree that if the standard Islamic narrative about Muhammad and the things he was accomplishing in Arabia were true, we should expect a lot more information about him. If Mecca was the trading hub that the Muslim sources say, we should expect to find ancient references to it and so on. We don't. So that's kind of the source of the disagreement. There's this big gap where there's a bunch of there's a big place where we don't have a lot of evidence to go on, and if you just have this big gap there, you can kind of say whatever you want, right? And so we're coming to different conclusions. We're coming to different conclusions with what to do about that. So we don't have the early sources that we would like to have. That's a problem. Normally, if you're doing history, the best thing to have is early sources. It's good to have multiple early sources so you can compare and contrast them and so on. That's generally what you're looking for. We don't have that, and so what do we do? We can conclude this was all made up, or you can do what I've done, is rely on some secondary historical principles, like, is this the sort of thing that would be invented and so on. For me, I can understand where Robert's coming from. At the end of the day, it's just too much. It's just too much stuff. If you were inventing one thing here, or if you couldn't understand why someone would make this thing up, that would be one thing. I could look at that and say, okay, you're right. I have no idea. When it's just hundreds of things and sometimes dozens of versions of the same issue. So for instance, the Satanic Verses, I have 50 Muslim sources on the Satanic Verses, 50. This is just a lot to invent. So here we have this story that we know is embarrassing, and we're just going to invent like 50 made-up sources on that. There are lots of things in history that people made up. That's true. People invent stories. The level of detail on a lot of this stuff, and the amount, the sheer volume of material they're producing on stories they're making up. It's just, I look at it and I go, wow, I see why someone might be skeptical, but this just seems like too much. It's just too many different stories, too many different problems, too much embarrassing material, and just too many versions of that for people to be just making all of this up. And so I think there's obviously a historical core there that is reliable. Tons of exaggeration, tons of fabrication, tons of embellishment, and so on. But there was definitely a historical Muhammad. So we have two hypotheses before us, and just think, why do we have such great arguments against Islam today? So much so that we can't even find a Dawa guy willing to stand up for Muhammad nowadays. We have this awesome material about Muhammad because Muslims preserved this. And so why does Islam need blasphemy laws? Because of this embarrassing material. They can't defend it and so on. That's why they have to have blasphemy laws against people from arguing about this stuff. So why is Muhammad such an easy target for us? According to me, it's because Muhammad was the most obvious false prophet in history. According to Robert, it's because the people inventing Muhammad for their new religion made him sound like the most obvious false prophet in history, when they could have made him sound like absolutely anything they wanted. They could have made him sound like absolutely anything, the most reliable, most trustworthy, most miraculous person who've ever walked the planet. Instead, they come up with a guy who, what did we go through? Thought he was demon-possessed, repeatedly tried to commit suicide, delivered revelations from Satan, was a victim of a magic spell, delivered false prophecies, accepted a meal prepared by a woman whose family had just slaughtered, died in exactly the way Allah said he would die if he fabricated revelations, married more women and girls than his own revelations allowed, married the wife of his own adopted son after causing the divorce by lusting after her, loved sucking on the tongues of little boys, was constantly covered in semen, and left us with a pretty good idea of where that semen came from. That's what they came up with. That's the guy they came up with. What's the best explanation here? Again, if it were one thing, one problem, that would be, I wouldn't say that's a huge problem for Robert's theory. When it's 487 different things, huge problem. So I think we can conclude that in spite of all the exaggeration, embellishments, problem with the Muslim sources, these guys were reporting on a guy who actually existed. And I'll just say, as my time runs out, that to all the Muslims who were cheering for me this entire time as I defended your prophet against the accusations of the Islamophobic Robert Spencer, what else can I say but you're welcome?
Okay. So, you heard it there. David Wood took the side of the debate that basically says, yeah, Muhammad's a real guy, and to shorten it up a little bit, if Muhammad was made up, he'd be a better human being. He's garbage, so he's probably not made up. He's probably legitimately. These are not made up stories to, I don't know, humanize a fictional character, but actual episodes in the life of a very strange man. Anyway, so let's hear Robert Spencer's view here.
David, you are some kind of amazing genius. But I gotta say, you're saying it's all too much when there's 487 different things. It's all too much, David says. Well, how about 593,000 different things? Because we know that Muslims fabricated at least 593,000 false hadiths about Muhammad, because Bukhari himself bears witness to that. Remember, he collected 600,000 hadith and only published 7,000 as authentic. He rejected 593,000 as fabrications. Now, that's a massive industry of fabrication. And I think he was absolutely right about those 593,000. He was just wrong about the other 7,000. They were fake too. And we know this because there's just no indication, not even the shadow of a hint, that any of this material existed in the 7th century. And it had to have existed in the 7th century if it's authentic. So, for example, from a completely different religion, and I know I'm opening a big can of worms here, but I'm going to do it anyway. In the Acts of the Apostles, Paul says, remember the saying of our Lord Jesus that it is more blessed to give than to receive. That statement does not appear in the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. It's oral tradition that Paul happened to recall while he was talking and is recorded in the Acts of the Apostles. And yet, when we come to 7,000, even just take Bukhari, 7,000 stories of Muhammad that must have existed in the 7th century, there is nary a person anywhere who says, as Muhammad said this, and quotes them. Nobody even gives a hint that that massive corpus of material exists. Nobody shows any sign that they know of any such stories. And so you got to wonder, maybe the easiest explanation is they didn't exist then. They were made up later. And David is also correct when he says they could have made him sound like absolutely anything they wanted. They did make him sound like absolutely anything they wanted. But what they wanted was not what we want. And what they wanted was not based on our own values and mores. They wanted to have a justification. for having multiple wives, and for having child wives, and for having homosexual lovers, and all these other things. So they made their guy have all that and more. They wanted to have justification for all these things, and we know that this is exactly what they did. That's why Bukhari was winnowing out 593,000 false hadith. He himself would have been the first to acknowledge, if he could have made it here today, that these stories were made up by people in order to justify their own proclivities or their own point of view in various Islamic factions. And so that's what they did. If these stories existed, I suggest that it would have been entirely reasonable that somebody somewhere, sometime between 632 when Muhammad died and 700, or for that matter, 700 to 800, or 800 to 830, that somebody would have said, you know, Muhammad had a saying for this, because they're carrying all this around in their heads, and yet it appears nowhere. Very, very strange, unless it just wasn't there at all. Thank you.
Okay, that's an interesting point, I think. Well, an interesting couple of points. They didn't want what we want, and that's why it seems weird to us, but to the fabricator, it may have been more appropriate to think about. There you have it. There's your closing arguments. One side, Muhammad's real. There's all this weird stuff because, you know, he was a real guy and he was weird. And the other side, the Robert Spencer side, saying, well, okay, there's all this weird stuff, but it justifies whoever invented it or made it up. It justifies something for them, or has meaning, attributed meaning to them. Well, me personally, I don't think you can make the case that some of the things are socially understandable to Muslims, because basically they didn't know what to do with the material. That's why a lot of it ends up untrustworthy now, even of the 7,000 in Bukhari. But you know, for example, the Satanic Verses, basically every Muslim alive, if you ask them about it, will say, those are untrustworthy, even though they're in a book calling them authentic, or multiple books, technically, multiple kitab. But, so anyway, there you have it. Again, I'll put the link to Modern Day Debate down in the show notes.